wasn't saying my boy. Why? Why? Yeah, you can admire his work all you want, but you know what? You can admire his work all you want, but I'll give you my take on it. Since you want to keep on yelling out my boy, 3 people died in that house that night.
The wrestling world loves to argue. Who was the toughest? Who could really fight? And when Paul Heyman names his toughest wrestlers, half the internet calls him a liar. But here is the truth. Heyman spent decades building an empire on one thing the fans could never question: real toughness. Not the cartoon muscles of the 80s, not the scripted drama everyone knew was fake. He found the grain of truth in every performer and turned it into something terrifying. His list of the 10 toughest wrestlers is not about who looked good on camera. It is about who survived, who bled, who refused to quit even when their bodies were screaming at them to stop. Heyman understood something the rest of the wrestling world was slow to figure out. In the information age, fans knew the business was scripted. They knew the outcomes were predetermined. But they also knew one thing could not be faked: pain. Heyman built his entire philosophy around that single truth. You cannot fake gravity when you crash through a table. You cannot fake blood when barbed wire tears your skin open. And you cannot fake an Olympic gold medal or a UFC championship. Heyman found the performers who had something real to offer, and he magnified it until the whole world believed. Start with the most dangerous man Heyman ever managed: Brock Lesnar, the beast incarnate, the conqueror. Heyman did not present Lesnar as a wrestler trying to win matches. He presented him as a prize fighter trying to inflict damage. This was not about entertainment. This was about dominance. Lesnar brought credentials that made him impossible to dismiss. He was an NCAA Division I heavyweight champion. He became the UFC heavyweight champion. These were not storylines. These were facts. Heyman took those facts and weaponized them. The centerpiece of the Lesnar narrative was the streak. When Lesnar ended The Undertaker's undefeated run at WrestleMania, Heyman turned a scripted outcome into a statistical anomaly. He shouted it over and over: the one in 21-1. By reducing the legendary Undertaker to a number, Heyman stripped away the mysticism and replaced it with cold, hard reality. Lesnar was not just another character in the story. He was the extinction-level event that ended an era. But Heyman went further. He talked about Lesnar's battle with diverticulitis, a life-threatening illness that nearly killed him during his UFC run. Heyman claimed that Lesnar was fighting at only 60% capacity when he became UFC champion. The implication was terrifying. If a sick Brock Lesnar could beat the best fighters in the world, what could a healthy Brock Lesnar do in a wrestling ring? Heyman created a nightmare scenario in the minds of fans. Lesnar was not just tough, he was unstoppable, even when his own body was trying to kill him. Heyman also used the tension between himself and Lesnar to heighten the drama. At SummerSlam, Lesnar turned on Heyman and hit him with an F5 through the announce table. This was not just a storyline beat, it was validation of everything Heyman had been saying. He had created a monster so dangerous that even his own manager was not safe. The violence was indiscriminate. It was real. It transcended the scripted nature of the performance. Lesnar's part-time schedule only added to the mystique. Heyman framed him as a mercenary holding the title hostage. Every appearance felt like a special event, a big fight feel. The scarcity made every Lesnar match feel like it mattered more than anything else on the card. Lesnar was the ultimate example of what Hayman called empirical legitimacy. His toughness was not a story you had to believe. It was verified by combat sports at the highest level. But Hayman knew he needed more than one monster. He needed a roster full of different kinds of danger. That is where Kurt Angle came in. Kurt Angle was the surgeon to Lesnar's sledgehammer. Angle brought an Olympic gold medal to the table. He won it with a broken neck. That fact alone gave him instant credibility. But Hayman needed to make sure fans understood that Angle's technical skill was just as dangerous as Lesnar's raw power. So he told a story, a backstage story about a shoot wrestling match between Angle and Lesnar. According to Hayman, the two men got into an impromptu grappling session backstage to settle a debate about who was the better wrestler. Hayman described it as lasting nearly 30 minutes, with neither man able to secure a definitive victory. He emphasized that Angle held his own despite giving up significant size and weight to Lesnar. Hayman said that nobody else on the roster could compete with either one of them. This story served multiple purposes. It validated Angle's technical ability by showing he could neutralize Lesnar's size advantage. It created a hierarchy of toughness. There was the regular locker room, and then there were the shooters. Angle and Lesnar existed on a different level. Most importantly, because the fight happened behind closed doors, fans could project their own fantasies onto it. Imagine violence is often more compelling than stage violence. Hayman understood that. Under Hayman's influence, Angle transformed from his early comedic character into something more vicious. He became the wrestling killing machine, a man who could snap your limbs as easily as he could deliver a punchline. This duality made him even more dangerous in the minds of fans. He was funny until he decided not to be. And when he stopped being funny, people got hurt. That unpredictability was its own form of toughness. But empirical legitimacy was just one category in Hayman's taxonomy. He also needed performers who embodied something older, something that connected the new extreme style to the history of the business. That performer was Terry Funk. Hayman made a calculated statement about Funk. He called him the only veteran from his era who had the reputation of being legitimately tough. This was not a casual compliment. It was historiographical revision. The wrestling world of the 70s and 80s was full of men with fearsome reputations. But Hayman isolated Funk as the only one whose toughness was compatible with the ECW philosophy. Other veterans protected their spots. They refused to engage with the hardcore style because they thought it was beneath them. Funk validated the new generation by bleeding alongside them. Hayman framed this as emotional toughness, the ability to suppress your ego in service of the performance. Funk's willingness to enter the bingo halls of Philadelphia and legitimize the younger roster was a greater act of toughness than any backstage fight. It required the kind of humility that most veterans did not possess. Funk was not afraid to be vulnerable. He was not afraid to let the new generation beat him up if it meant building something that would outlast him. The narrative reached its peak at Barely Legal, ECW's first pay-per-view event. Hayman orchestrated a moment that blended fictional triumph with real-world reverence. When Funk defeated Raven to win the ECW World Heavyweight Championship, it was not just a scripted victory. It was a coronation of the brand's legitimacy. Hayman took it further. He presented Funk with a commemorative belt paid for by the wrestlers on the ECW roster. They declared him the lifetime ECW World Heavyweight Champion. This detail revealed Hayman's definition of leadership toughness. Funk inspired genuine loyalty from a locker room known for its cynicism. By highlighting that the roster paid for the belt out of their own pockets, Hayman marketed Funk not just as a tough opponent, but as a beloved patriarch. When critics called ECW garbage wrestling, Hayman could point to Terry Funk, a former NWA World Heavyweight Champion, a peer of the greats. If it was good enough for the Funker, it was legitimate art. Hayman's connection to Funk ran deeper than business. When Funk's health declined, observers noted that Hayman was crushed by the loss. Hayman had the chance to speak with Funk in his final weeks and chose to withhold public tributes because he got to say everything while Funk was still alive. This relationship underscored a recurring theme in Hayman's management: the transactional nature of loyalty. Funk gave Hayman credibility. Hayman gave Funk relevance in a changing world. The toughness Hayman marketed was Funk's refusal to fade away quietly, his insistence on raging against the dying of the light with barbed wire and branding irons. It was poetic, almost literary, and Hayman used it to give ECW a soul. While Funk represented spiritual legitimacy, Hayman also needed to create legitimacy from scratch. That is where Taz came in. Taz was a project of pure construction. Hayman transformed the Tazmaniac, a wild feral gimmick, into Taz, the disciplined judo killer. This is perhaps the greatest example of Hayman's ability to manufacture danger through aesthetics and terminology. Hayman realized that a short wrestler could not be tough in the traditional sense. Not in a land of giants, but he could be dangerous. So Hayman overhauled everything about Taz to mimic the rising world of mixed martial arts. The look was critical: the black and orange singlet, the towel over the head like a boxer entering the ring, the crossed arms creating a silhouette of focus and discipline. Every visual element communicated that this was not a pro wrestler. This was a fighter. The language was just as important. Hayman instructed the commentators, particularly Joey Styles, to use terminology borrowed from judo and jiu-jitsu. Moves were not slams. They were suplex variations. Wins were not pins. They were tap-outs and submissions. The monikers reinforced the narrative: the human suplex machine, the one-man crime spree. Taz was not presented as a person. He was a mechanical force of destruction. Hayman created a catchphrase for Taz that encapsulated the psychological warfare: beat me if you can, survive if I let you. This reframed the objective of the match. It was not about winning, it was about survival. This shifted the burden of toughness onto his opponents. They were brave just for stepping in the ring with him. Even if they lost, they survived. That was the victory. But constructed legitimacy had limits. The research highlights an incident with Mike Awesome. Awesome was leaving ECW for WCW, and in their title match, he refused to sell Taz's offense. He broke the agreement. This revealed the fragility of constructed toughness. Unlike Lesnar, who could force compliance physically, Taz relied on cooperation from his opponents. When that cooperation was withdrawn, the illusion wavered. Hayman managed the aftermath brilliantly. He continued to praise Taz's intense style and judo background. He reinforced the narrative narrative over the reality. Years later, Hayman still discusses the human suplex machine origin as a pivotal evolution in ECW. He believed that perception is reality if you market it consistently enough. The reconciliation between Rob Van Dam and Taz in later years added a layer of retrospective maturity. The toughness of that era eventually evolved into mutual respect among survivors. Hayman taught the wrestling world that you could build legitimacy from nothing if you controlled the language and the presentation carefully enough. Empirical shooters and constructed killers covered offense. But Hayman curated a separate class of toughness defined by defense, the ability to absorb punishment. This was the domain of the masochistic survivor. Nobody embodied this better than Mick Foley. Hayman repeatedly cited Foley's willingness to suffer as his defining characteristic. In retrospectives, Hayman asked a rhetorical question: how could you not believe in Mick Foley? This question cut to the core of his strategy: empathy through trauma. Hayman recognized that Foley, operating as Cactus Jack in ECW, possessed unique psychological toughness. He was not just taking bumps, he was enduring pain to tell a story. Hayman booked Foley in scenarios that tested the limits of human endurance. The most brilliant example was the anti-hardcore run. In a stunning inversion, Hayman had Foley turn on the bloodthirsty ECW fans. Foley refused to be their monkey. He would not engage in violence for their amusement. Instead, he wrestled technical matches and cut promos denouncing the crowd's bloodlust. This demonstrated moral toughness, the strength to stand against the very culture that made him a star. Hayman framed Foley's refusal to be violent as a deeper, more profound form of toughness than the violence itself. It was the toughness of integrity, the ability to say no when everyone is screaming at you to say yes. This elevated Foley beyond the hardcore label. He was not a stuntman. He was a philosopher of pain who chose when and where to suffer. If Foley was the philosopher, Tommy Dreamer was the everyday practitioner. Hayman's rebranding of Dreamer is the stuff of legend. Dreamer started as a generic pretty boy who got booed mercilessly by the cynical Philadelphia crowd. Hayman transformed him into the innovator of violence and the heart and soul of ECW. The turning point was the Singapore Cane match against the Sandman. Dreamer lost and was forced to take 10 lashes. He took them. Then, in a moment of unscripted brilliance that Hayman immediately capitalized on, Dreamer asked for another. "Thank you, sir. May I have another?" This moment defined Hayman's doctrine of resilience. Toughness is not about winning, it is about not quitting. Hayman framed Dreamer as the Iron Man of the locker room, the reliable soldier who would go down with the ship. The research notes that Dreamer and Joey Styles were among the few who stayed with ECW until the very end. They refused contracts elsewhere. Hayman used this loyalty to paint Dreamer as a tragic hero. His toughness was his stupidity, his refusal to leave a dying company because he loved it too much. This emotional vulnerability made Dreamer the ultimate underdog. Fans could project their own struggles onto him. Decades later, Dreamer still refers to Hayman as the greatest manager, despite the well-documented financial problems of ECW. Bounced checks, unpaid salaries. This enduring loyalty speaks to the psychological hold Hayman had on his talent. He convinced them that their suffering was part of a greater artistic cause. He transformed financial exploitation into a shared badge of honor. That is its own form of manipulation. But it worked. Dreamer's toughness was not physical, it was emotional. The ability to believe in something even when all the evidence says you should walk away. Then there was Sabu, toughness via insanity. Hayman marketed Sabu as homicidal, suicidal, genocidal. This was not just a rhyme, it was a warning label. Sabu's toughness was elemental. He was a force of nature that could not be reasoned with. The research mentions Sabu taping his own wounds mid-match, often using superglue and maintaining a vow of silence to preserve his mystique. Hayman exploited the silence. By having a mute monster who communicated only through violence, Hayman created a blank canvas for audience fears. Sabu's botches, often from attempting physically impossible moves, were spun not as failures, but as evidence of his suicidal commitment. If Sabu crashed and burned, it was because he did not care whether he lived or died. That made him unpredictable, dangerous in a way that went beyond skill or strength. But the research also highlights a darker side. A note mentions Sabu needing crowdfunding for funeral expenses later in life. This raises questions about the cost of the toughness Hayman marketed. While Hayman praised Sabu's durability, the long-term physical and financial toll was catastrophic. The toughness Hayman sold was extracted at a high price from the human beings performing it. This complicates the narrative. It suggests that what looked like toughness might have been exploitation dressed up in poetic language. Beyond ring mechanics and stunts, Hayman recognized a third category: social and political fortitude. The ability to lead a locker room and control a crowd. The Undertaker embodied this perfectly. Heyman's reverence for Undertaker centers on leadership and presence. presence. The research highlights that Hayman credits Taker for steering a very tough locker room era. This was a locker room filled with egos, politics, and legitimate tough guys. Taker's toughness was authoritative. He did not need to constantly prove he could fight. His presence alone was a deterrent. There are stories of Taker acting as Vince McMahon's personal enforcer. Wrestlers like Randy Orton were terrified after accidentally hurting him. Hayman frames Taker as the conscience of the WWE. This is political toughness, the ability to maintain order in chaos. By positioning Taker as the gatekeeper of the streak in the locker room, Hayman enhanced the big fight feel of any match involving him. Beating Taker was not just winning a match. It was overcoming the institution of wrestling itself. His toughness was not about what he could do to you. It was about what he represented: authority, respect, the old guard that would not be moved unless you earned it. Then there was Steve Austin. Before Stone Cold, there was Stunning Steve Austin, a talented technician stifled by WCW bureaucracy. Heyman's contribution to Austin's legacy was providing the platform for him to develop his grit. Heyman brought Austin to ECW after his WCW firing and did something revolutionary. He gave him a microphone and told him to vent. The research indicates that Heyman allowed Austin to steer his own creative direction. He encouraged Austin to channel his real-life frustration into his promos. Heyman praised Austin's uncompromising edge and his drive to exceed everyone's expectations. In Heyman's taxonomy, Austin's toughness was intellectual and attitudinal. It was the chip on the shoulder. By allowing Austin to blur the lines between his real anger and his character, Heyman birthed the shoot promo style that would define the Attitude Era. He taught Austin that toughness was not about looking cool, it was about being undeniably, uncomfortably real. The Dudley Boys represented environmental toughness. Heyman's stories about Bubba Ray and D-Von revolve around their ability to incite and survive the riotous atmosphere of the ECW arena. Heyman positioned them as the ultimate heels capable of generating nuclear heat. The research details how Bubba Ray would antagonize the crowd to the point of near violence. Security had to physically restrain fans from jumping the guardrail. This required psychological toughness, the courage to be truly hated by a mob of drunk, angry men. Every night they walked into a building where people wanted to hurt them. That takes a specific kind of bravery. Furthermore, the physical toll of tables, ladders, and chairs matches established the Dudleys as standard bearers for tag team durability. Heyman used them to export the ECW style to WWE. He proved that the extreme philosophy could work on the grandest stage. Their toughness was their adaptability, taking a niche, violent style and forcing it into the mainstream through sheer brute force and charisma. To fully understand Heyman's impact, you have to categorize the types of toughness he curated. This reveals how he built a diverse roster where every wrestler had a unique, non-competing claim to legitimacy. The empirical shooters like Brock Lesnar and Kurt Angle derived danger from verifiable real-world combat accolades. Heyman blurred reality by citing NCAA and UFC records. He circulated backstage stories of shoot prowess. The constructed killers like Taz derived danger from aesthetic, terminology, and intensity. Heyman used MMA language. He protected finishers. He adopted a fighter look with towels and singlets. The masochistic survivors like Mick Foley and Tommy Dreamer derived toughness from high pain tolerance and emotional durability. Heyman highlighted the physical toll. He framed endurance as moral victory. He used loyalty as a narrative device. The chaotic elements like Sabu and Terry Funk derived toughness from total disregard for personal safety. Hayman framed recklessness as courage. He emphasized risk and unpredictability. The authorities like Undertaker and Steve Austin derived toughness from leadership, presence, and respect. Heyman focused on grit, conscience, and the ability to police the environment. This taxonomy reveals something profound. Heyman democratized toughness. Before Heyman, tough in mainstream wrestling usually meant large like Hulk Hogan, or it meant amateur credentials like the Steiner brothers. Heyman expanded the definition to include the undersized like Taz, the unathletic like Foley and Dreamer, and the psychologically unstable like Sabu and Austin. By broadening what constituted a tough guy, Heyman allowed a wider variety of performers to connect with audiences. He taught fans that taking a beating was just as respectable as giving one. This shift was crucial for the success of the Attitude Era, which borrowed heavily from the ECW template. Heyman proved you did not need 24-inch arms to be tough. You just needed the will to survive. This was revolutionary. It changed how wrestling fans perceived toughness forever. Heyman's obsession with shoot attributes also served as a cultural bridge between theatrical 80s wrestling and the mixed martial arts explosion of the 2000s. Heyman was booking submission specialists specialists, and hybrid athletes before UFC had fully penetrated mainstream consciousness. He conditioned the wrestling audience to respect the mechanics of fighting, the takedown, the submission, the ground and pound, not just the dramatics. Heyman moved the needle from cartoon strength to combat efficacy. He prepared the wrestling fan base for the arrival of stars like Ken Shamrock and Dan Severn. Eventually, Brock Lesnar's crossover success. Heyman did not just market toughness, he re-educated the consumer. This had long-term effects that rippled through the entire industry. Paul Heyman's contribution to professional wrestling is often measured in championship reigns or pay-per-view numbers, but his true legacy is the architectural reconstruction of toughness. Through his advocacy of Terry Funk's spirit, Brock Lesnar's power, Taz's technique, Mick Foley's heart, and all the others, Heyman created a multi-dimensional universe of danger. He understood that for wrestling to work in a post-information age world, the audience needed new metrics for belief. They could no longer believe matches were legitimate athletic contests, but they could believe the athletes were tough individuals. Heyman provided evidence for that belief. A gold medal, a scarred arm, a relentless refusal to quit, an NCAA championship, a UFC title. These things could not be faked. In the Heyman worldview, toughness is the ultimate currency. It is the one thing that cannot be manufactured in a scripted sport. You cannot fake gravity when you crash through tables. You cannot fake blood when barbed wire tears skin. You cannot fake an Olympic gold medal. Heyman found the specific grain of truth in each wrestler's toughness and built entire mythologies around them. He amplified that truth until it obscured the scripted nature of the violence. He did not just manage wrestlers. He created legends of legitimacy. Terry Funk taught him that emotional durability mattered as much as physical strength, that the willingness to validate a new generation was its own form of courage. Brock Lesnar showed him that verified combat credentials could turn a performer into an extinction-level threat, that statistical dominance could replace mysticism as a source of fear. Kurt Angle proved that technical skill properly marketed could be just as dangerous as raw power. That backstage mythology could create hierarchies of toughness the audience would accept as real. Taz demonstrated that you could construct legitimacy from nothing if you controlled the language and the aesthetics, that a short man could be terrifying if you convinced people he was a trained killer. Mick Foley embodied the philosophy that suffering could be its own form of artistry, that the willingness to endure pain for a story created empathy powerful enough to overcome any scripted outcome. Tommy Dreamer showed that loyalty and stupidity were sometimes indistinguishable, that the refusal to quit even when logic demanded it was the purest form of toughness. Sabu represented chaos, the idea that unpredictability is its own weapon, that a man with no regard for his own safety is more dangerous than any trained fighter. The Undertaker taught Heyman about presence, about how authority can be a form of violence, how the right person in the right position can maintain order through sheer force of personality. Steve Austin proved that authenticity matters more than polish, that channeling real frustration into performance creates something audiences cannot look away from. The Dudley Boys showed that environmental toughness is real, that the ability to incite and survive genuine hatred requires a specific kind of bravery most performers do not possess. Each of these men represented a different facet of toughness. Heyman did not try to make them all the same. He celebrated their differences. He built a taxonomy where everyone had their own lane, their own claim to legitimacy. This prevented them from competing with each other. Instead, they all elevated each other by representing different aspects of the same core truth. Wrestling might be scripted, but toughness is real. The genius of Heyman's approach was recognizing that the audience had evolved. They knew the business was predetermined. They knew the outcomes were decided in advance. But Heyman understood that knowing something is fake does not eliminate the desire to believe. People want to believe. They just need a reason. Heyman gave them reasons. He gave them verifiable credentials, visible scars, documented injuries, real-world achievements in combat sports. He also gave them stories that felt true even when they were not. The backstage wrestling match between Lesnar and Angle, Taz's judo background blown up to mythical proportions, Tommy Dreamer's loyalty to a company that could not pay him. These stories worked because they contained emotional truth. They felt like they could be real. That was enough. Heyman's greatest trick was convincing the world that in a business built on lies, the pain was the only thing that was real. And in a sense, he was right. When Mick Foley fell off the cell, that fall was real. When Sabu tore his skin open on barbed wire, that blood was real. When Brock Lesnar ended the streak, the shock on people's faces was real. Heyman found the reality inside the fiction and made it the centerpiece of his promotional strategy. This approach had consequences, some good, some troubling. On the positive side, Heyman expanded what it meant to be a tough guy in wrestling. He made space for different body types, different skill sets, different psychological profiles. He proved that you did not need to be 6'5" and 280 pounds to be believable as a badass. You just needed something real to offer. This democratization of toughness opened doors for performers who would have been dismissed in earlier eras. On the negative side, the emphasis on real pain and real sacrifice created a culture where performers felt pressure to constantly top themselves, to take bigger risks, to suffer more dramatically. This led to shortened careers, chronic injuries, and in some cases, financial ruin. Sabu needing crowdfunding for funeral expenses is a stark reminder that the toughness Hayman celebrated often came at a devastating personal cost. The question becomes whether the art justified the suffering, whether immortalizing their pain made it worthwhile. Hayman would probably argue that he gave these men purpose, that he elevated their sacrifice into something meaningful, that without him, they would have been forgotten. There is truth to that. Terry Funk's ECW run introduced him to a new generation. Mick Foley became a legend partly because Hayman knew how to frame his pain as heroic. Tommy Dreamer found his identity in ECW after being rejected elsewhere. Taz became a star despite his size because Hayman built him that way. But there is also truth in the counter-argument that Hayman exploited these men, that he took their willingness to suffer and turned it into profit without ensuring they were protected long-term, that the loyalty he inspired was a form of manipulation that kept them working for bounced checks and broken promises. Both things can be true simultaneously. Hayman can be both the genius who revolutionized how wrestling presents toughness and the promoter who extracted that toughness at too high a price. What cannot be argued is the impact. Hayman's philosophy changed professional wrestling permanently. Every hardcore match, every shoot-style promo, every time a promoter emphasizes a wrestler's real-world fighting background, that is Hayman's influence. He taught the industry that in an age where fans know the business, you need to give them something they can believe in, something that feels authentic, something that hurts too much to be fake. Which of Hayman's 10 do you think was the toughest in real life? Not in storyline, not in character, but the actual human being behind the persona. Was it Brock Lesnar with his verified combat sports success? Was it Kurt Angle who won an Olympic gold medal with a broken neck? Was it Terry Funk who kept performing into his 70s despite a body broken by decades of violence? Was it Mick Foley who lost an ear and kept wrestling? Was it Tommy Dreamer who stayed loyal to a company that could not pay him? Maybe toughness is not a single thing. Maybe that is the real lesson from Paul Heyman's taxonomy. Toughness can be physical dominance like Lesnar, technical skill like Angle, emotional durability like Dreamer, moral courage like Foley during his anti-hardcore run, psychological fortitude like Undertaker leading a chaotic locker room, authenticity like Austin channeling real frustration into his character, adaptability like the Dudleys exporting their style to the mainstream, recklessness like Sabu disregarding his own safety, humility like Funk validating a new generation. All of these men were tough in different ways. Heyman's genius was recognizing that and building a universe where each type of toughness had value, where each performer had a unique claim to legitimacy. He did not try to make them all the same. He celebrated what made them different. And in doing so, he created a roster where everyone could be the toughest guy in the room in their own specific way. That is the legacy, not just the individual performers, but the philosophy, the understanding that toughness is multifaceted, that there are many ways to be legitimately dangerous, that you can construct an empire on verified reality, calculated mythology, and the willingness of performers to sacrifice their bodies for the performance. Paul Heyman did not invent toughness, but he redefined it for modern professional wrestling. He created a taxonomy that the industry still uses today. If you found this deep dive into the real toughness behind Heyman's greatest clients valuable, make sure you subscribe to this channel. We are building a community of fans who want to understand the psychology and philosophy behind professional wrestling's greatest moments. The stories that explain why certain performers connected with audiences on a deeper level. Hit that subscribe button so you do not miss the next analysis.